cassette tapes and players did not simply join other mass mediums like records and radio. They became the media of the masses. Cassettes, in many ways, were the internet before the internet. They enabled anyone to produce culture, circulate information, challenge ruling regimes, long before social media ever entered all of our daily lives.
This is Phantom Power.
Welcome to another episode of Phantom Power, a podcast about sound, where I talk to people who make sound and people who study sound. I'm Mac Haygood. I'm a media professor at Miami University, and I just want to start off by giving a quick shout out to a couple of creative communities that I got to hang out in. I just got back from the Residual Noise Festival at Brown University, which was this amazing 3-day event featuring ambisonic sound art and music pieces performed both at Brown and at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. The lead curator of the festival was Ed Osborne, who is the chair of the art department at Brown and a very accomplished sound artist. And in the middle of the festival, there was this one-day conference, and Ed was kind enough to invite me to be the keynote speaker. And then I had an onstage discussion with Emily Dolan, the chair of Brown's music department, and someone whose work I've followed for a long time. And it was a real thrill to meet her as well. But really, the biggest thrill of all was the sounds. 3 days of these immersive ambisonic creations by amazing artists in these amazing facilities, both at Brown and RISD. And most importantly, there is just such a creative and fun and diverse and nurturing community of composers and sound artists at these two schools. I'll put a link to the festival in the show notes, and hopefully we may also feature some of these artists in coming episodes. And then the week before that, I visited the Center for Cultural Analysis at Rutgers University. And they've been having this 2-year-long sound seminar chaired by professors Carter Mathis and Xiaojue Wang. And they invited me to come over and talk to their faculty and grad students and postdocs about my work. And I got to learn about all the fascinating sound-related stuff that's happening over there at Rutgers. That was also a blast. So I just want to thank Carter and Xiaojue and Ed for the invitations, and thank all of you for listening, because so many people at these events came up to me and said how valuable they find this podcast. And I never anticipated sort of making so many new friends and working relationships through this show. So I feel super fortunate. And that also reminds me, last episode, I mentioned trying to get our Patreon sponsorships up so that I can pay an editor and keep this show going during the summer. And we got an unprecedented upsurge in memberships. So thank you so much. We still kind of have quite a ways to go for me to reach the break-even point on production costs. So please, if you've been thinking about doing it, maybe do it now. Just go to patreon.com/phantompower. You'll get all the bonus content from today's show and all the previous shows. Speaking of today's show, let me talk about it. I'm calling this a Cassette Theory Mixtape. We have 3 excellent scholars who have recently published books that help us understand the medium of magnetic tape and its history as a medium for the masses. My guests are Eleanor Patterson, Associate Professor of Media Studies at Auburn, whose new book just won the 2025 Broadcast Education Association's Book Award and the 2025 International Association for Media and History Book Award. It's called Bootlegging the Airwaves, Alternative Histories of Radio and Television Distribution, out on Illinois Press. We also have Rob Drew, Professor of Communication at Saginaw Valley State University. Rob is a fantastic interpreter of pop culture. He's done work on graffiti and karaoke, and his new book is called Unspooled, How the Cassette Made Music Shareable, out on Duke University Press. And we also have Andrew Simon, senior lecturer in Middle Eastern Studies at Dartmouth College. And I've been wanting to talk to him for a while about his book, which came out back in 2022. It's called Media of the Masses, Cassette Culture in Modern Egypt on Stanford University Press. These three books encounter their subject matter in different historical moments and geographies, and I thought it would be really exciting to sort of bring these great scholars together to discuss the cassette tape's many purposes and meanings in everyday life. I should say that Eleanor's book is not exactly about the cassette tape, but she gives us this really amazing prehistory that I think is very helpful in thinking about the cassette tape. This is also the first time that I've had three guests on at once to just sort of have a roundtable discussion. So let me know what you think about this format. It's something I've been wanting to do for a while. It's so hard to get people's schedules together, and I managed to pull it off this time. So let me know what you think. All right, so cassette theory, a mixtape. Let's do it. Nora, Rob, Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to have all of you with me. And I thought maybe we could just start off with each one of you doing a bit of a self-introduction and giving us sort of the short elevator pitch of your book before we really dive in, sort of set the stage for us. And Nora, why don't we start off with you?
All right. Well, thanks for asking. My book is called Bootlegging the Airwaves, Alternative Histories of Radio and Television Distribution. And it's really a case study look at on-demand listening and viewing and really peer-to-peer file sharing before the internet, with looking at analog technologies, kind of at the birth of broadcasting and radio up through the 70s and 80s. And I just think that these are stories about histories of audience, of fans, and the labor they do in distributing content. I'm really a distribution scholar more than anything else. So I'm thinking about how programs get to people and in what ways they encounter, and how those technological, social assemblages shape how we make sense of content, but also form relationships and make sense of ourselves. And I look at a few different case studies. Bootlegging is a really hard thing to study, so I won't say my book is comprehensive, but I look at some communities of radio and television fandoms that were connecting with each other, doing home recording and sharing content, really at a time where the only other way to listen or encounter programs was to tune in on a schedule determined by the industry. And so, that's the very small version of my book. So I'll stop there and let the others have a chance. I'm really excited to hear about the other books we're talking about.
Great. Yeah, Rob, why don't you go next?
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Mac. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I started this book as a book about mixtapes way back when, ages ago, back in the 90s when people were making a lot of mixtapes. And I started finally getting to interview people when I finished my karaoke book. My previous book was about karaoke in the 2000s. And by that time, people weren't really making tapes anymore. They were making CDs. But I was interviewing people on my campus. They kept referring to them as mixtapes and kept talking about how much they missed tape, even young people. So I thought, well, I have to look into this, into the history of it, and ended up going kind of down the rabbit hole of cassette history, which it became kind of a history of the cassette, especially from the perspective of both distribution and redistribution. Nora refers to herself as a scholar of distribution. I think I've become that myself. And the cassette is both a very practical format for people to cheaply and easily share their own and others' music, and as what became kind of a symbolic format for a lot of people, a format that carried a lot of resonance as something that symbolized community, symbolized DIY resourcefulness. And the book kind of turns on that moment in the early 80s when both the feds are going after the cassette to some degree, talking about imposing royalties because of home taping. At the same time, there are a lot of independent artists and small artists who are picking up on 4-track recorders and putting out their own tapes and advertising them through small zines and such. So it doesn't claim to be a comprehensive history of the cassette, but sort of as a distribution format for independent music.
Yeah, and it's a moment very near and dear to my heart because I lived
Me too.
that moment. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. Okay, Andrew.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Mac, to be on the podcast. We actually read your book, Hush, earlier this term for a sound studies group at Dartmouth College.
Nice.
So it's a pleasure to be here with you and Nora and Rob today. So the inspiration for my book, Media of the Masses, is the Arab Spring. I was living in downtown Cairo in the days leading up to Hosni Mubarak's downfall, this event that many people billed as a Facebook revolution. And it was that motivated me to look into media, sound, not only in terms of what I was witnessing around me, but the history of it in the case of Egypt. In grad school, I started writing papers on particular artists and musical genres, and I came to realize the thing connecting all of these topics were cassette tapes. I set out then to write a history of the cassette that became a history of modern Egypt. And something that I seek to show in the book is that cassette tapes and players did not simply join other mass mediums like records and radio. They became the media of the masses. Cassettes, in many ways, were the internet before the internet. They enabled anyone to produce culture, circulate information, challenge ruling regimes, long before social media ever entered all of our daily lives. And that's the story that I strive to tell in this project.
Fantastic. All right. That's really helpful. And I thought maybe what I do is sort of zoom in on some pieces that I found interesting about each of your books. All of you just feel free to jump in if that if you hear something that resonates with something from your own research, or if you have a question. So a little bit more one by one. And then I have a bunch of questions that I want to ask for the whole group, because I saw a lot of interesting resonances between these three books, which I very much enjoyed reading. Nora, I thought I would start with you because you do give us this really fascinating prehistory of not only file sharing, but it's really even a prehistory of cassette circulation, right? Like you start way back. And so I'm very interested in why you did this. I'm really grateful you did, because it actually, for my own research, I found this helpful, because you seem to find out a lot about control, that people were looking for a sense of control in this sort of progressive era, the Victorian era, transitioning into this more modern era. People are starting to have things like the phonograph and the telephone, but they feel like they lack a sense of control over these things. And so I was wondering if you could talk more about control and what you call preservation culture, and just this moment of the progressive era and the prehistory of cassette tape trading.
Yeah, sure. It's funny because you called this Cassette Jam, and I was thinking I don't really talk that much about cassette.
No, you don't, but but I think it's so relevant.
It is. And actually, cassettes do play a big part in this, and they come up at interesting times. But I am a nerd, I guess. I don't know. I'm a big fan of Lisa Gilman and Jonathan Stern, and these ideas that formations don't come out of a void, right? If we think of tape trading as like a social practice, it doesn't just occur, like it comes from somewhere. And so I was thinking it's, to write a genealogy of tape trading, which is, my book is essentially mostly about tape trading. I also look at communal practices of viewing in places where that bootlegging really was more limited and it wasn't a one-to-one practice, but I think the reason I dive back to the progressive era, most media's cultural historians, we know that the post-industrial revolution, that time period in the late 1800s is where we see those roots of mass culture. And that's also, I was wanting to think about home recording, because Rob kind of talked about distribution and redistribution. And I think if you're redistributing content, so let's say recordings, you're also reproducing it too. And they just, a big fan of the research method I call stumble upon, where this project started when I stumbled upon these classic radio fans. I tuned into a radio show where they were playing like some really old episodes of Yours Truly, Johnny Dollar from the late 50s, early 60s. And I was like, why are people still listening to this? Where do these recordings come from? And it turned out that the local broadcaster, a public radio station, he told me most of the stuff he got were from fans who would give it to him or send it to him, these recordings of old radio shows. And I can't think about that without thinking about home recording, because their genesis is either air checks off the air or through trading and reproducing them in their home through home recording technologies and then sharing with each other, so redistributing. And the history of home recording goes back to, Edison and the phonograph in the late 1800s, and the ways that we kind of already were accustomed to having those technologies in our home. That market didn't exist. It was made through advertisements, and a lot of them marketed the phonograph as a technology that you could play with, that you could use to entertain yourself by making your own home recordings. And that's at the same time that home movie cameras are being marketed by Kodak. And it's just that as I'm like letting the archive lead me towards my research, it really became clear to me that this is a moment where the home becomes redefined through these new technologies and control over them. The ability to play back the recordings you're making or the recordings of music that you're buying. And that the music is not the only type of home recording or not the only type of content being marketed for the home. Some of the first examples of home entertainment are being used by companies like Edison in the late 1800s. And so that's where I wanted to really start, because that's the technological apparatus that radio becomes introduced to. So people are already accustomed to now having vaudeville recordings in their home or speeches or music that they get to select when and where they listen to that. So it's not a surprise that the earliest radio recordings are actually pre-cassette tape, using these little home recording machines made by Pathé or Vic, where you'd have pre-grooved lacquered discs that you could make your own home recordings. And the earliest examples I found discussions of are like Amos and Andy recordings on these little pre-grooved discs from the late 80s. So that's where I
and that fits in with a longer history of people being exposed to new kinds of media. And it seems at the time like a sort of overwhelming flood. And you don't know how to manage it all. You don't know what to do with it. Going back to the newspaper era, I think Mark Twain made a lot of his money off of like selling scrapbooks to put newspaper clippings in, or like he had a special kind of scrapbook that you could re-stick the newspaper clipping without ruining the clipping or something. My colleague, my former colleague,
Katie Daygood, right?
Katie Daygood, did a great history of this called From Scrapbook to Facebook, where she's kind of making a somewhat similar move to what you do in your book, Nora, which is like looking at these parallels and sort of asking, like, what is the desire here? And one of the points that you make is that it's a lot about capturing ephemerality. Like, the ability to record sound gives us a way to suddenly cling on to something that always just sort of evaporated in thin air. And when you have that ability on the phonograph, but then when you're on the telephone or the radio and you don't have that ability, you kind of feel like something's missing. I can't keep this conversation. I can't keep this great Amos and Andy show, or what have you. So this is sort of like, I think you used the term like preservation culture for this kind of desire.
I might have.
Do I remember that right?
Yeah, I might have been citing somebody else.
Okay, that's fine.
And there's a great book about preservation cultures, and because this is also the same moment that our government is going out in the field to record the indigenous tribes. And so it's this impulse of preservation. But I kind of build on that because I think part of that effective relationship to ephemeral content during this moment of modernity is a desire to grasp on. And I think scrapbooks is one of those grassroots ways of kind of managing ephemerality. This is also a moment where you start having, Baudelaire talks about street artists trying to capture fleeting moments. And I think sound recording is a big part of that. A desire to capture and store and replay. And I think radio producers didn't understand this in the industry for a very long time, how we as listeners have an effective relationship to the entertainment that we engage with and how it's comforting and how we want to control and listen to it again. These are storage mediums. And people are using it to capture these moments so they can relive them and replay content or replay. Radio programs are coming into the home. There's a difference, I think, too, in that intimacy. Listening to Amos and Andy, it's vaudeville, but it's not, because it's in your house and they're addressing you within that broader context of having home entertainment, but also they're alive and you're hearing them. A desire to capture and be able to store that and bring that and replay it on demand whenever you want to. Because you would be having your radio alongside your phonograph player too. So I mean, that's kind of the way that these technologies were being made sense of in the home as connected to each other. And in 1929, I think the first radio console that is directly hooked up to a phonograph player too, when RCA buys Victor. And so it's a story of industry as well, right? Like the market adjusting and understanding audience engagement to a certain extent.
I want to move on to ask Rob a question, but you have this one image that I think really encapsulates this desire, and it's way back in 1877, an image from Punch's Almanac, and we'll put a picture of it on the screen for those who are watching the YouTube version, but it's like this couple in this wine cellar, and there are all these bottles, and the concept seems to be that telephone conversations or the telephone sound, whatever that means, has somehow been bottled in these wine bottles. And now they can, or I guess it's classical music that has somehow been bottled. And now people can sort of bring these things out of the wine cellar to their dinner party and play like I don't know.
Yeah, no,
some opera or something.
I love that cartoon. And I kind of stumbled upon it. Like, I was like, I guess I'm going back to 1877, you guys. Giddy up.
Yeah.
And this was just after some of the first discussions and demos of the talking machine. You know, it wasn't really released at that point. Edison is not thinking about music. But this artist, and I think he was in Britain, he immediately becomes taken up in popular culture as this possibility of, and I think the telephone is just the word that's being used for electronic wires, you know, or like this mode that you could have a wire from the concert hall and record it through that technology and bottle it up. And their visual of the storage medium is like a beer barrel or a wine barrel. And it's like you uncork it for the pleasure of entertainment.
Yeah.
So this idea that you would
not so far from the cassette tape.
Yeah, right. Well, these are all storage mediums, and I liked that because you can see it's already in the Victorian imaginary of the popular uses of this technology beyond like a dictaphone or business uses.
Yeah, Rob, one of the things that I took from your book is that you're really paying attention to the way, and that this is sort of gets back to themes that we would see in Lisa Gittleman, but sort of like that in different contexts, the cassette has different properties and meanings, like the assemblage around the technology is different. And you're really focused on this particular moment that you, in a very scholarly way, call Anglophone post-punk indie rock, which I appreciate the specificity there. But you talk about how the cassette was an important medium of distribution for this kind of music, or at least was perceived to be, but also that the cassette became sort of a totem of this scene itself and had this really deep cultural meaning. So can we maybe start with what was this scene and why the cassette?
Yeah. Well, there were a number of zines in the early 80s, most notably Op magazine out of Olympia, Washington, that start to run these columns devoted to independent cassette. And as soon as they're announced, they're flooded with independent cassettes. And that wasn't the only one. There were quite a few zines around the country that are running columns devoted to indie cassettes. And those vary in their genre, in the type of music that they include. But indie post-punk really looms large and picks up on it very heavily, I think partly because, as you say, those values of independence, obviously, and of community outside the music industry and alongside the music industry by that moment in the early 80s really loomed large within this culture. And the cassette just played into that very nicely. It had its moment, sort of, then. There were certainly other musicians who recorded to cassette prior to post-punk indie rock. But those, the cassette as a format and post-punk indie rock as a kind of structure of feeling or a way of approaching music making really dovetailed quite nicely. Just the idea of music making as not something necessarily done for profit, but something done as a sort of gift to fellow musicians and to fans as a part of a community. I like to think of it as a kind of erotic assemblage where people coming together, musicians coming together with a common sense of the cassette as something that really goes beyond. This is at the very same moment when, of course, independent vinyl labels are coming to the fore, SST and a lot of others, Alternative Tentacles up in San Francisco. And they have this idea, too, that we're gonna get outside the music industry. We're just going to do it ourselves. But, of course, you still need to get to a pressing plant for that. And you still need to go through that common channel of vinyl. The idea of having a format outside of vinyl that they could latch onto was something that I think really appealed to a lot of artists and kind of played into, again, the idea of independence. It did vinyl one better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You said that you really started off this project because you were thinking about mixtapes. And I was so glad to see that you did this because even though you're focused on indie music, you sort of do this comparative study of the discourse of the mixtape within indie culture and within hip hop culture, where it had a different kind of meaning. Can you talk about why you took that approach and like what you learned from that kind of comparison?
Yeah, my emphasis was on independent music culture and the kind of mixtape that at least I was used to making, which was just a sort of concatenation of songs at home on your stereo, usually by switching between vinyl records and that sort of thing. Now, mixtape took on a whole alternative meaning within hip-hop culture. Hip-hop DJs actually mixed together music, and it grew out of, first of all, the cassette was central to hip-hop from its very beginnings. For the first 5-6 years of hip-hop, there were no vinyl records. It was a live form. It was a performance form, of course, and started in the South Bronx and was distributed to the degree that it was distributed all in recorded form. It was distributed informally by way of cassettes, by the artists involved, the DJs involved, or fans of theirs. And the first hip-hop vinyl record, famously, was Rapper's Delight, which it didn't even come out of the hip-hop culture of the South Bronx. It was made in New Jersey by Sugar Hill Records. So slowly but surely, within the ensuing decade or so, between the late 70s and the late 80s, DJs primarily, not so much MCs, but DJs, spearhead the idea of recording onto cassette, sometimes at their club dates, sometimes at home, and distributing these, sometimes on the street, just selling them off the street in the park, or sometimes bringing them to so-called mom and pop stores. A lot of this is going on in New York, of course, at first. And eventually there are even small companies devoted to it, although it's, of course, very much under the radar because this is all extra legal. These are re-recordings of existing songs that are being mixed together without copyright clearance. So that was the world of hip-hop. Whereas, what I call the indie mixtape, I think it's a little more general than that, but mixtaping, as a lot of us knew it, was something that the idea of putting a bunch of songs together on a tape in order to give to somebody you loved, somebody you had a crush on, or just a friend to impress them with your tastes. That's, just one after another, the song. So that's what I primarily concentrate on as a format that represented love rather than theft. That was the big transition I see for the cassette in the early 80s, was a symbol of theft to a symbol of love.
Because the industry portrayed it as this outlaw medium, and it became this kind of sentimental medium for people. I liked that argument, and it certainly rings true for me. Andrew, you told us today that you were really inspired to do this project, or at least to start thinking about sound in Egypt, because of your experience during the Arab Spring. And I'm sort of curious about hearing more about the sounds of that revolution. But also, I think it's pretty appropriate that that's the case, because there's this real tension in your book between the sort of power of the state and the masses, even at the level of technology, right? Where, like, for example, you say that we can't really understand the role of the cassette in Egypt if we don't understand the role of radio in Egypt, which was a state-run medium. So maybe I kind of asked two questions there, to take it where you will.
Sure. Thanks so much. There's a lot of resonances too with both of these other projects. In the case of the revolution, I mean, something I was doing an intensive Arabic fellowship that was based in downtown Cairo at the American University in Cairo's old campus, right on the border of Tahrir Square, which becomes the epicenter of the revolution. And so I ended up missing a lot of class. And when I was at those protests, I mean, a number of things piqued my curiosity. So artists who had passed away decades ago were revived and their songs resurfaced once more. We had individuals who were not well known whatsoever. They rise as new artists in the course of the revolution. There were chants that rhymed, poetry was being performed in the square, and all of these different things really piqued my curiosity in sound and its power. And then based on those firsthand experiences too, going back to my apartment, turning on state-controlled Egyptian television and seeing them screening a documentary about penguins rather than the protests that were calling for the fall of an authoritarian regime, this disconnect between those respective stories and narratives. And so when I set out to explore cassettes then, this notion of control was central to that project, because here we have this question of who has the right to contribute to culture, who controls the shape that culture assumes. In the case of Egypt, mass culture that Nora mentioned, it wasn't just an abstract idea. It was a state-engineered program where they would send out officials into the countryside in Egypt and stage things like Shakespearean plays to try to elevate and educate the masses. Radio in Egypt that you mentioned, Mac, had been state-controlled since 1934. There were multiple screening committees on the radio. There was a text assembly, a listening assembly. If you passed exams that you would have to perform in person for both of those committees, individual stations then, it was at their discretion of whether or not they would even broadcast your song. So radio was seen as a school for the masses. It popularized a very small pool of elite performers. Cassettes then come to represent this immense source of anxiety. So I was coming across these articles in the popular Egyptian press declaring war on the cassette. We had these critics saying cassettes posed a greater danger than cocaine to citizens, because with cassette tapes, anyone has the potential to be a cultural producer rather than a cultural consumer. And it's not something that's seen as emancipatory or democratizing in a good way on the part of cultural gatekeepers. It's seen as a source of immense anxiety. And so that question of control is something that I try to explore in the book, which also, to Rob's comment, it takes the shape of a mixtape, the book itself. So each chapter revolves around a particular idea, from things like consumption, the law, and taste, to circulation, history, and archives. And then Nora's remark about the stumble upon methodology, that was something that was really central to my work, because the Egyptian National Archives end in 1952. So if you want to tell a story of anything in Egypt after 1952, you don't have access to any documents in the National Archives, which then became this question of how do you write the history of a nation without its national archives? Well, you go out into the street, you go to paper markets, you go to private collections, you conduct oral interviews, you come across these cassette recordings in antique shops. I found hundreds of photographs in garbage bags that once belonged in family albums that I had to piece back together again. And so with this story, I introduced this notion of a shadow archive. Everything that exists in the shadow of the inaccessible Egyptian National Archives, how does that enable us to tell different stories about the past? And then the outcome of that is just one of those stories in this project.
Yeah, and I really appreciated in your book how, Rob, you did this as well. It had a sort of a section of the book that was about methodology. The photos and the garbage bags is already very intriguing to me. And just thinking about what you said about the cassette tape being more dangerous than cocaine, I don't know if this is real, but somebody sent me this text or is a social media post allegedly from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement that says if it crosses the U.S. border illegally, it's our job to stop it. And then in the background, it says people, money, products, ideas, which is, which I'm like, wait a minute, First Amendment? No. So I don't know if that's really an ICE.gov post or not, but in the present moment, I tend to believe it is. So yeah, that tension between the state and the masses when it comes to media. One thing that really made me chuckle on that theme was when I was reading your book, I was thinking about Charles Hirschkin's book, The Ethical Soundscape, which looked at Islamic cassette sermons in Egypt and the way that they sort of helped workers like taxi drivers kind of create a contemplative and ethical space in their day-to-day life. And then I laughed out loud when I read your study of what you called the vulgar soundscape that cassettes created in Egypt. So it's like a very opposite use case. Can you maybe talk about this moral panic around vulgar music on cassettes in Egypt?
Sure. Thank you. And Charles's book is the inspiration actually for that title. When people think of cassettes in the Middle East, they tend to think of one of two things. So it's Charles Hirschkin's The Ethical Soundscape book, or it's the 1979 Iranian Revolution and cassettes and Khomeini and his use of that medium to relay those messages. And so when I was reading Charles's book, which I greatly enjoyed, one of the impressions that study could lend with its focus on Islamic cassette sermons is that Egyptians are just listening to Islamic sermons all the time. But the same people that listen to Islamic sermons also listen to Michael Jackson, also listen to the Spice Girls, also listen to popular Egyptian artists. I wanted to show them the complexity and the breadth of that soundscape. And then also to push back a little bit on the association with cassettes and the Iranian Revolution. So I wanted to tell a story that did, I would say, three things. When people talk about the 70s and 80s and the 90s in Egypt, there's an overwhelming focus on religion. This is this period of the Islamic revival, is how it's characterized. There's this focus on very momentous events, things like the 1967 war, the 1973 war. And then there's this concentration on authoritarianism. I wanted to pivot all of those. So in the story that I wrote, I tried to shift the focus from the religious to the profane, from the momentous to the mundane, from the consolidation of power to its contestation. And cassettes enable us to do that. And this moral panic is something that was so enjoyable to read about and explore as well, because there's a whole genre, for instance, of music called mahraganat music that becomes very popular after the Arab Spring. A number of mahraganat artists now, their songs are the top trending songs globally, yet alone in the Middle East. And when people talk about that genre, they use phrases like the contamination of public taste, the corruption of morals, the pollution of Egypt's soundscape. And something that I came to see in the course of my work is that none of those accusations are new. The same things were said about shabi, or this other genre of popular music, going back to the 70s. And that is a history that I try to share through the prism of cassette tapes in this book.
Yeah, I love that. So maybe now we can just talk a little bit about some of these themes that are running through, I think, 2 or in some cases all 3 books. I mean, one thing I certainly notice is this desire to produce this kind of counter history that you just mentioned, this sort of people's history, if you will. Is there something about the cassette that sort of lends itself to this, that it becomes an object? Or, you know, Nora, in your case, I mean, you're talking about video cassettes, and you're also talking about people using open reel recorders, I suppose. So maybe we're getting a little bit beyond the cassette, but something about home taping or the practices that people do with this that help give us a different view on media industries.
I think it's very easy to be very utopian about home recording. But I do think that you kind of shift from one gatekeeper to another a little bit. If you're not, you are able to, I do think that cassette or reel-to-reel or VHS, like home recording, gives us a power to everyday individuals to a certain extent, right? But I think we trade in that instance, like when we talk about radio and those, like what we think of as the industrial players within radio, you know, like network and sponsor and local affiliates. You're kind of trading off those for different companies like Sony or Philips, right? Because they're making the hardware that facilitates home recording. And there is a cost and an expense that it's a privilege to be able to do home recording at a certain level. I mean, I think it is more democratic in many ways. The population I was looking at, especially with radio in the 50s and 60s, even into the 70s and 80s, radio collectors were audiophiles as well. And so that's maybe a distinction of that case study. But reel-to-reel tape was perceived as a higher quality, as a better fit. If you're recording off air, you can record a longer amount of time because cassette tapes are limited. And I'm sure this comes into play with mixtapes or home recordings that are being made to spread information. I find that fascinating because I was thinking as Andrew was talking, like, I wonder what the difference is because like Rob, a lot of my historiography was bound to fanzines and newsletters. And as Andrew was talking, I was like, I wonder about the difference between cassette tapes as facilitating like a social network and communication in a grassroots, informal way, and how that maybe is distinct or connected to print. Because print, like everything I looked at in my research, a lot of it was hand in hand. When I started looking at these communities of people sharing content, they're kind of making their own bicycle network, and they connect through newsletters.
You're actually anticipating one of the questions I was going to ask. No, it's perfect. Because I too I was super interested to learn that the old time radio nerds had zines. Like I was like, whoa, this isn't just like an indie rock thing. This goes back before that. So it was interesting to hear about a different subculture that was into that. And then I was thinking about these relationships between different media and the fact that cassette tapes couldn't circulate themselves, right? You needed this assist from the zine in order to do it. And then that made me wonder, Andrew, in the Egyptian context, was there also like some kind of zine equivalent going on that helped people know what tapes to get? Or was it more an oral culture where there were these tape stands and you were more like going on foot or driving to somewhere and learning about tapes that way?
Sure. I think cassettes surface in a number of different places. So some of them would appear at sidewalk kiosks. We had state-controlled recording labels that had stores that also sold cassettes. But I think something, even returning to your earlier question as well about this people's history, placing those two things into conversation, is that one of the artists I look at who was challenging the stories told by Egypt's ruling regimes, things like when Richard Nixon comes to Cairo during the throes of Watergate in the summer of 74, and the Egyptian government welcomes him with open arms, rolls out a literal red carpet for him. This singer, his name is Sheikh Hammam, I'm writing a biography of him now, completely flips the script on that story entirely. Refers to Nixon as a groom that one married as a last resort, spits on him audibly in recordings of that song that's called Sharaf Ya Baba Nixon, or Welcome Father Nixon to Egypt. That song circulates on non-commercial cassettes. And so it's not released by any label. It's not found in any kiosk. It's not available in any store. People would go to protests where he performed the song, record him, or in informal house parties in people's living rooms, record a cassette, copy the cassette, copy the cassette. So here we had an artist that was encouraging piracy. That's how their music circulated. In an interview once, he said, "My media are the masses." And so we have these individuals that are dependent upon that hand-to-hand circulation outside of those state-controlled channels. And that is just kind of one glimpse into this more bottom-up people's story of this technology, where if we were just listening to something like the radio, we wouldn't even know Sheikh Hammam existed. He's only accessible through this medium and an exploration of it.
I was amazed by that story, and we're definitely going to play a little clip of that so we can get a sense of what that song sounds like. Rob, is this bringing up anything for you as well?
I just keep thinking about, I think this started with the idea of the cassette as a people's format or something like that, like an outsider. But I'm really struck by the contrast between our work in terms of the work the cassette is doing and the sort of communities it's advocating for, at least in our account. I kept thinking, first with Andrews, whose book I love, and talking about the cassette artists as sort of low culture and kind of this almost Soviet-style system of this paternalistic old cultural, like you say, Shakespeare in the Park or Shakespeare in the... And now we have these folk artists who are condemned as low culture and as profane. The word you kept using was vulgar. I don't think that the artists who I talk about mostly on cassette are mostly viewed by anybody within the mainstream as vulgar. I think they're just ignored mostly. You know, they're such outsiders. And, you know, when people like Beck or people like Liz Phair or whoever start to pick up on cassettes and use it as a sort of stepping stones for vinyl releases, that's a different matter. Those are legitimate artists. But most cassette artists who are, again, advertising in these fanzines and selling a few copies for the price of a blank tape are just so outside the mainstream that nobody even bothers to condemn them. And so that was one contrast. And then with Nora's book, I kept thinking the tape trading. So the closest analog I think of that I did not discuss at all, but sometimes wish I had and would love to get to research about it, I've thought about it, is Grateful Dead culture, the tape trading and the preserving the ephemera, like you say, that fascinating beginning you have of recording media themselves, back to Edison, originating not for this idea of spreading new music, but preserving existing utterances and preserving existing music and preserving performances. So that's not really the two things I'm talking about. On one hand, artists who can't get a hearing otherwise, recording onto a few cassettes and then sending them out by mail as a result of these zine ads. Those are original recordings. And then mixtapes are one-to-one expressions for the purposes, as I say, of either courting or showing off or things like that. We're just creating connections. But neither of them are really in the spirit of a trading network like you have. This network, frankly, I hope you don't mind my using the term, kind of nerdy network of traders of wrestling videos and things like that. Long story short, the differences between our project and the differences between the communities involved really interested me as much as the similarities, even though we're kind of all concentrating on some form of outsider culture.
And I should say, one really amazing thing about Nora's book is there are some very fine photographs of professional wrestlers with just admirable amounts of chest hair. Like, it's really, really impressive. So I just think, that's just another reason to get the book.
Just get the fly out the shelf now.
Yeah. Well, anything I could do to help.
Well, that's
It's not only an award-winning book, it's also just got hot wrestling action.
The heel. Yeah, it's the heel. I think I know exactly. I really wanted that photo in there.
And that's it for this episode of Phantom Power. Huge thanks to Eleanor Patterson, Rob Drew, and Andrew Simon. The conversation keeps going in the Patreon version. It really gets kind of fun because they start asking each other questions and we really get into a freewheeling conversation. So if you want to hear that, just join the Patreon at patreon.com/phantompower. While I'm thanking people, I want to say big thanks to Niso Sasha, who has been doing editing work on this show for the past 2 years, and Caitlin Fan, who has been doing all the backstage stuff, including transcripts and uploading the show to servers and whatnot. I really couldn't have done it without them. They have been fantastic to work with over the past 2 years. Just the best students you could ask for and doing really professional work. And I just want to say thanks to them as the school year winds down. Our theme music is by Alex Blue, who I recently got to hang out with on Zoom. Great to see you, Alex. And that's it for this episode of Phantom Power. I'll see you next time.